It's a great honor and privilege to welcome you to this Dearest lecture with Jan Vogler. Jan is assistant professor at the Department of Politics and Public Administration at the University of Konstanz. He received his PhD from Duke University. His research interests are very broad and varied, but they include the historical origins and legacies of bureaucracy, the political economy of the European Union, and recently the origins of European imperialism. He has established himself as a leading young scholar in the emerging field of quantitative historical political economy, and he's also an organizer of the virtual workshop in historical political economy. So sign up if you want to participate there. He has published in numerous top journals in political science, including World Politics, Constitutional Political Economy, and European Union Politics. And we will see his lecture on pandemics and political development, the electoral legacy of the Black Death in Germany. This is based on a World Politics paper co-authored with Daniel V. Gingerich from the University of Virginia. And this article actually won the MPSA best paper in comparative politics in 2021. Jan will talk for 45 minutes and then followed by a Q&A session. So keep the, but you are free to ask questions of clarification during the lecture. Well, I'll hand it over to Jan.
Yeah. So thank you everyone for coming here this morning, and I hope that I can deliver an interesting lecture. I want to thank Lasse for inviting me, and I just have to note I didn't know this would be recorded, so I'm glad I dressed up a little bit, right? So let me now get started and present this project to you. Lasse already mentioned the title, and I just want to say that this was a pleasure to write together with my friend and colleague Daniel Gingrich at the University of Virginia. And before I go into detail on our research project, let me give you a little bit of a background on this specific topic of the Black Death, because this was an unparalleled historical shock that European societies and societies in other world regions experienced in the 14th century. And let me just use the city of Cologne, which is very close to my hometown in Germany, to illustrate what happened at the time. So Cologne at this time was a center of trade and pilgrimage on the European continent and played an important role on the continent. And with 50,000 people, it was actually one of the largest European cities at the time. Paris was the largest one with, I think, 200,000 people or so, but 50,000 people meant that Cologne was a city of significant size. And as I mentioned, it was also a center of trade and pilgrimage, and that was generally good for the city because it brought in a lot of wealth. But in a specific situation, that of the Black Death, it was actually a bad thing because the Black Death spread through trade primarily. And so when the Black Death pandemic hit the city of Cologne, it brought a lot of devastation to its population, and it lost an estimated 29% of the population. Now put this into perspective when we compare this to the recent COVID pandemic, which also had a disturbing effect on our societies, but it had a much lower mortality rate of only about 1% of the population. And so put this into perspective, a loss of 29% of the population was really magnitudes larger than what we experienced. And this is also one of the reasons why at this time it was perceived to be the apocalypse. Many people really thought this was the biblical end of the world, and now that would be basically indicating that the apocalypse was about to come. What should be pointed out, though, is that the Black Death was not a homogeneous shock. Instead, if we look at variation between cities, some cities were actually mostly spared. So, for example, the German city of Osnabrück only had a mortality rate of 4%, while Hamburg, which at that time was also a trade center, a harbor city in the north of Germany, right, had a mortality rate of 58%. So it lost close to 2/3 of its population. And again, these numbers are striking, especially in comparison with the pandemic that we have recently experienced. Now, what this points to is that the Black Death had significant spatial variation, right? It was not homogeneous where it hit, it really had some variation in terms of its intensity. And that is important because especially in the social sciences, if we look at a lot of previous research in the social sciences, including in economic history and economics, quantitative studies, many of these studies assume that the Black Death has a homogeneous impact across space. And what they do is they then take the Black Death as, for example, a binary variable that is either 0 or 1, either you were hit or not, and then they look at, for example, the distinction between pre- and post-Black Death. And what we do in this study is we provide both a theoretical and an empirical response to what we believe is a very strongly simplifying notion, and we hope to advance the literature in this respect by really paying attention to divergence in the intensity of the Black Death across space. And we are political scientists, my co-author and I, or political economists. And so the key research question that we are now trying to answer here is, can pandemics have lasting consequences for political behavior? Now, we recognize that the Black Death is a unique pandemic because it is actually the deadliest pandemic in human history in relative terms of the population that died. And so for that reason, the Black Death is a unique phenomenon, but I think it's a very important world historical event, and so it deserves a comprehensive analysis also from the perspective of political science. And before I go into all the details of our study, what I like to do at the beginning is to give you a broad overview of what it is that we claim and what it is that we find. And let me just quickly say the key takeaway of our study is that the Black Death had a major and persistent political impact that lasted for centuries. And I think this is actually no surprise because the Black Death was an event that reshaped society in many different ways. And so we would expect that there is a political impact and a lasting one too. And what was surprising to us is when we started the study that actually very few, almost no political scientists at all had paid attention to this historical phenomenon. And so the previous research was primarily focused on socioeconomic changes, for example, in the dimension of wage increases. And in fact, the Black Death has found a lot of attention in the field of economic history, and we were lucky to be able to rely on a lot of studies in that field that really helped us also understand the dynamics, the historical, political, and economic dynamics that happened at this time. And so let me just quickly point out our theoretical contribution. So these parts of the theoretical chain have mostly been explored by others before, so this is not completely novel. There was this major adverse labor supply shock, a consequence of many people dying at the time, that led to a change in factor prices, and the two key factors of production at the time were labor and land. It was a very simple agricultural economy, and that led to a socioeconomic power redistribution where the serfs, the former serfs, gained much larger bargaining power. Now again, these parts of the causal chain have already been established by previous researchers, and the main contribution that we make is that we focus on what was the institutional consequence in the political sphere. And the institutional consequence was that there was a higher likelihood of the emergence of proto-democratic institutions, and then we also examine the long-term legacies of these institutions. And what we do in order to do this, to conduct this analysis, is that we create a novel measurement, and that we call the Black Death Exposure Intensity, or BDEI score. This is a measure that really focuses on spatial variation in the intensity of the Black Death. And the structure of the rest of the presentation is I will provide you with a little bit more on the background, because I think there are some interesting aspects of the geographic variation in the intensity of the Black Death that I should point out. Then I will develop our theoretical framework in more detail. I will talk about the empirical test. And then I will pay some special emphasis or special attention to the mechanisms. And finally, I will talk about some challenges, empirical challenges that we have received when we presented this paper and how we respond to them. So let me now tell you a little bit more about the Black Death. So as I mentioned, this was an unparalleled shock, and importantly with a non-uniform spatial distribution. And I want to just show you this map of Europe. And here what you see is the timing of the Black Death. When and where did the Black Death hit? And what you can see here is the areas in red, in the darker red shades, were the ones that were hit the earliest. You can see Southern Europe was hit the earliest. And then as we see, the Black Death moved toward Eastern and Central Europe very slowly and gradually. And what is important to point out are two things. The first one is this is a map of the timing. But what historians have found is that the timing was very strongly associated with the intensity of the Black Death. There may have been some learning mechanism in the background where people learned, oh, there's a plague going on, and maybe the people who were in these areas then learned to, for example, not accept any foreigners who were coming to their cities, right? So there may be a little bit more of cautious behavior and so on and so on. Overall, what we see is that the intensity decreases over space, and then there's this important area which is mostly present-day Poland. At this time, of course, nation-states did not exist, and the borders that you can see superimposed here are just for your orientation. These nation-states as they exist today did not exist at the time. But what is important about this specific area is that there was only, you can probably not read this, but there was only a minor outbreak. So these areas were mostly not strongly affected by the Black Death, and that is very important to point out that there is a lot of spatial variation. Now, if you look at this whole map of Europe, there's one area in particular on the European continent that exhibits most of the spatial variation, and that is what is the German-speaking lands of Central Europe. Again, today it is a nation state. At that time it wasn't. It was more an assembly, a mixture of different kinds of smaller political units. But nevertheless, this is a perfect geographic region to study variation in the intensity and long-term impact of the Black Death. And this is also reflected by some data that was gathered by economists, among others. And so what we see here is we have access to local level data. Now, these data are imperfect, right? And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But what we see here is that we have local mortality rate data across the German-speaking lands of Central Europe. And an interesting aspect of these data is that they are mostly in line with what we already know about the intensity of the Black Death, right? So we have very few observations here in the eastern parts, which were the ones that were hit very late and where there was only a minor outbreak. So the data that are available to us are not perfect by any stretch, but they're mostly in line with historical knowledge that we already have about the spread of the pandemic. Now let me talk about our theory. So the starting point is that the economy that existed at the time in Europe was mostly an agrarian economy, a very simple, much simpler economy. There were some cities, as I pointed out, but the bigger cities were already 20,000, 50,000 people. These were some of the biggest cities in Europe, right? And when you have cities that are that small, in quotation marks, then you already see that these cities do not allow for a very complex division of labor, right? So the range of goods and services that was produced was severely limited when compared to modern and industrialized economies. What was central to this economy at the time was not only the political economic system of feudalism, which was more at the macro level, but also the institution of serfdom, which was an institution of labor coercion where serfs were bound to a parcel of land. It was not as severe and not as bad as slavery, but it was nevertheless a system of labor coercion that very severely restricted the freedom of those that were subjected to it. And in this economy, if such an economy experiences a demographic collapse such as the one that was created by the Black Death, then what we will see is a major shift in the price of factor prices of labor and land. The way you have to think about this is if something becomes very scarce, from the perspective of economics, it becomes very valuable, right? So what happened at the time was when there was a dramatic collapse in the population, then one of these factors, and that is land, would suddenly lose relative value, and the reason is that labor would increase in its relative value because it became the scarcer factor of production, right? And this is exactly what happened. So in the areas where we suggest or where we observed that there was a high Black Death mortality, which meant a major labor force reduction, we saw that certain dynamics unfolded. There were dramatic, sudden increases in the returns to serfs from fleeing their manors, the ones that they worked at and that they were formerly bound to. And that led to a state of elite competition where the former, or the lords, right, that were formerly in this privileged position where they were in control of the serfs and they had the dominant socioeconomic position, suddenly found themselves in a situation where they had to compete for labor, right? And that was not something that they were used to. The laborers, on the other hand, suddenly had a lot of opportunities and they fled either to other manors where they could get better conditions, or they also sometimes fled to the city, and that resulted in higher rates of urbanization. And so what the consequence of these dynamics was the erosion of serfdom and the emergence of an incipient free labor market coupled with a tendency of greater levels of urbanization, right? And you can really see here that if we talk about this primarily agrarian economy, that these are dynamics that really reshape society as it existed at this time. And the loss of elite power that was associated with that also led to greater economic equality and greater bargaining power, economic bargaining power on the part of the former serfs. Now, this dramatic restructuring from our perspective also has political implications, and there are two sides to this. The first side is that the serfs will likely use that increased socioeconomic bargaining power to also ask for changes in political institutions, right? So socioeconomic power changes cannot be lasting if you do not also change the institutional framework that governs society at the time. And this is exactly what we observed, that the lower classes of society asked for more political power. So they wanted to make their gained socioeconomic power more permanent also in terms of the institutional framework. And then in addition to that, in some areas the lords had died and the serfs were left to themselves, and so they began to self-organize and to create organizations, collective organizations that would allow them to govern themselves rather than being governed by a lord. And so what we see here is that this reconfiguration of socioeconomic structures led to the emergence of what we label participative institutions or proto-democratic institutions, where there was now also power redistributed to the lower classes in society. This did not mean that the nobility was wiped out, right? So the nobility still existed. It just had to share its political power with the lower classes, and that was an important consequence. There's a question there?
Sir, may I ask a clarification question?
Yeah.
What would be the rate of mortality among the elite and among serfs?
So there was not a big distinction at the time. There were minor distinctions, and the reason is there was one area in which the nobility had an advantage, and that was nutrition. If you had better nutrition, your body overall had a stronger immune response to the disease. But the unprecedented nature of this disease meant that many people, whether they were rich or poor, were not prepared in terms of their immune response, right? So both rich and poor people died, some kings died, many of the nobility died, so the distribution was not totally uneven. The nobility had a small advantage in terms of the nutrition, but many people, both among the poorer parts of the population and the richer parts of the population, died. One thing I should also point out is the richer population often had access to medicine, but medicine at this time was not systematic and was not as professional as it is today. And the consequence of medicine not being so professional is that many of the people who claimed to be medical professionals actually provided, let's say, ways of healing people that were actually detrimental to their health, right? And so because the richer people had access to this false medicine, sometimes, for example, bloodletting was seen as a cure to that. Some of them died unnecessarily because they followed that advice, right? So overall, the distribution was not completely uneven between those two different groups, yeah? Okay, so let me also talk about the other scenario, and that was a low Black Death mortality rate that was associated only with a minor labor force reduction, right? And so in this scenario, what we think is that all the dynamics that I've just talked about do not appear in the same way. So in these cases, it is actually plausible because just a minor share of the serfs has died, the population has died, to employ greater coercion instead of higher wages. Of course, there was also, in this scenario, even if just a few people died, there should be a shift in relative factor prices. But what we believe is that if there's only a minor labor force reduction, there is the possibility to maintain the old system through coercion, right, instead of allowing these free labor market dynamics. And so what happens in this case is that the customary labor obligations associated with serfdom were either maintained or became more onerous for the population. And so here, serfdom persists in a highly unequal and hierarchical agrarian economy, and little urbanization follows from also very little movement of people between the different manors. And that overall means we have the maintenance of elite power, and the emergence of participative institutions is unlikely. Now let me put this into a broader perspective, and I think this slide here then summarizes our long-term expectations very well. Here we differentiate between three different periods. The period of the initial shock, which lasted from approximately 1347 to 1351. Then we talk about the early modern period, and eventually what we also do is we make predictions about the dawn of mass politics, because especially in the case that we examine, and I will talk in a little bit more detail about this in a moment, in the case that we examine, we expect that the local political cultures that were created by the Black Death were able to persist for several centuries. And I will explain why this was the case in a moment. But let me just point out, we start again here in this graphic with the high loss of life, where then labor coercion is dismantled early as a consequence of the labor market dynamics that I just pointed out. And in the early modern period, we then see the restructuring of socioeconomic relations, where as a consequence of the socioeconomic power redistribution, we see the development of early participative institutions, both in terms of participative institutions that help the lower socioeconomic groups to participate in political processes, but also sometimes just for them to collectively self-organize without the elites interfering, as happened in parts of southwestern Germany. And I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. Now, if these conditions, so we have greater socioeconomic equality and we have the introduction of participative institutions, if these conditions can persist for a long period of time, we believe that this is reflective of a self-reinforcing political economic equilibrium where we have not only greater socioeconomic equality, but also persistent and strong, robust democratic institutions. And in the areas where this was the case, we make the prediction that at the dawn of mass politics, because these areas had this robust experience with democratic engagement, what we will see are weak conservative and strong liberal parties. What I should point out, when I use the term conservative here, I use it with the meaning that it had at this time. At this time, conservative parties were representatives of the elites and were often in favor of a strongly hierarchical society, often a society that resembled feudalism to some extent, right? This is different from conservative parties today, right? So I'm not making any prediction about that. And the liberal parties were the parties that represented more of an egalitarian view of society. And so in that sense, the distinction here is a distinction made at the time. And just very briefly about the other scenario, right? So in the low loss of life scenario, labor coercion remains feasible. And as a result, the traditional socioeconomic relations are maintained. There's no emergence of these participative institutions. And in the long run, we predict that because these areas were not able to gain any experience with democracy, that we will see strong conservative and weak liberal parties. Again, the strong conservative parties are the ones representing the traditional elites at the time. Now, we decide to use Germany to evaluate this argument. A key reason I've already shown you on the previous map that this is a case where we see a lot of spatial variation in the intensity of the Black Death. And so that was part of the rationale for our case selection. The other part was that there was no centralized political regime. Those of you who are familiar with German history know that Germany was not fully unified politically until 1871. So for several centuries, the decentralized character of the Holy Roman Empire allowed local political units, cultures, institutions to persist mostly unaffected by a strong centralized regime. This is as opposed to, for example, France or Britain that became nation states at a very early stage and therefore also had stronger centralized institutions that then interfered with local politics. So we would not make the same predictions about those cases. Why did we then choose the 19th and early 20th centuries as our long-term outcome? The reason is that we believe this differentiation that was introduced by the Black Death is unlikely to persist to the present day. First, there was massive population resettlements after World War II, and then also we believe that later stage industrialization processes and the way they reshape societies also disturbed these political economic equilibria that were introduced by the Black Death. Let me just very briefly talk about this historical persistence in Germany one more time. So there was no centralized political regime in Germany until 1871 when Germany was unified by Bismarck through the German Wars of reunification or unification. And this allowed for this persistence and variation of local political cultures. I found this very nice anecdotal example of the Els Castle. This castle in Rhineland-Palatinate was owned and inhabited by a branch of House Els since the 12th century. Actually, it is still owned and inhabited by them today, right? And this is a great anecdotal example for how, in the long run, things that happened in the past really shaped even present-day outcomes. Now, let me briefly talk about the case of Imperial and Weimar Germany too. So Imperial Germany, here we look at the Conservative Party of the 1870s in particular, because it is a perfect outcome in line with our theoretical predictions. This party officially, formally in its party program, embraced an estate society and was highly elitist both in its ends and in its means. So it promoted, among others, also the intimidation of the lower classes, and it tried to manipulate elections. So overall, this party, not only in terms of its vision for society, but also in terms of anti-democratic means that it used to manipulate elections, is very much in line with our predictions. Now, Weimar is, of course, a little later, and one might say there's a problem with looking at Weimar because what we have is we have a lot of nationwide trends that are going on throughout the time of Imperial Germany, but also throughout the period of Weimar Germany. So we see that, of course, we have German unification, then there's the process of industrialization, increased urbanization, and also between those two periods, there's World War I. And one could plausibly make the argument that whatever historical divergence was created by the Black Death is reduced through these major trends that are nationwide, that are happening nationwide. At the same time, it should also be pointed out that prominent scholars of the geography, the electoral geography of Weimar Germany, make the point explicitly that a plausible interpretation of voting patterns, even in Weimar Germany, relates to historical events. And so O'Loughlin here, in his 2002 piece on the geographic distribution of voting behavior in Weimar Germany, suggests that this is a plausible explanation, was simply a complex mosaic of culturally identifiable microregions. And then he explicitly says, a product of a history of local principalities and weak central authority. So this is very much in line with our own reasoning and arguing. And so what we do here is we believe that it is plausible to also look at the vote shares of the most anti-democratic party that existed at the time, the Nazi Party, and we look at the two crucial elections, the 1930 and 1932, July 1932 election, to see if we also see patterns of voting affected for the Nazi Party. So how do we then construct our measurement? We create this new measure, the Black Death Exposure Intensity Score, and the key goal here is to assess the variation of the Black Death across space in terms of its intensity. And the reason why we do this is it is related closely to our theoretical framework, where we predict that the labor market shock is the key mechanism that then leads to the socioeconomic power redistribution. But for this labor market shock to have maximum effect, it is not sufficient if a single location is affected and then everything around it remains spared, because then we can very quickly restore the old equilibrium. If we really want to see a lasting change in the political economic equilibrium, it cannot only be a single location and everything around it is spared. We really need to pay attention to the number of outbreaks and the intensity of outbreaks all around any specific location. And you can think about this as us measuring how close is any geographical unit to the center of gravity of the pandemic. So what we then construct is the score, and here I will give you a verbal representation that I will supplement by a mathematical formula in a moment. The Black Death Exposure Intensity Score represents the sum of recorded outbreak intensities, and we inversely weigh them by their distance by a factor k that we vary to the considered location in our empirical analysis, which in some cases is an electoral district. So the BDI score is here. This is our formula, and here is the local mortality rates for all the units j. Then we weigh them by the inverse distance to j, and we discount this exponentially by a factor k. What this exponential discounting does is that outbreaks that are farther away get exponentially discounted, right? And so they play less and less of a role as they are farther away from the location that we consider. And then we vary k as a discount factor, and we use the values 3, 6, 9, 12, and 15. The reason why we do this is we want to show you that our results, because this is to some extent an arbitrary choice, but we want to show you that these results hold even if we use many different values of k for the discount factor. And overall, we then take the sum and then standardize the BDI score, because we create different versions, right? These versions 1 through 5, and we want all of them to have a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1 to make them more comparable in terms of their interpretation. Now, this is our regression format where our yi are different forms of dependent variables. Some of them are electoral outcomes. We also have beta 1 here. That is the coefficient associated with the BDI score. That is the coefficient of interest. We have a bunch of geographic controls. I will briefly speak about them in a moment. And then we use spatially clustered standard errors. Yeah?
How did you measure the difference in serfdom in Germany before Black Death?
So serfdom was prevalent across all of Germany before the Black Death?
But
Yeah.
it was different. Serfdom was not a solid institution, that's for sure.
Yeah,
There
so,
were differences across Germany.
You're pointing to an important thing. Actually, serfdom was more severe in the previously western parts of Germany. And the reason is that in the eastern parts, those were relatively recently colonized. And one of the things that the people who colonized these parts of Germany wanted to do is they wanted to incentivize the people to come there. And so they offered slightly better conditions. This means that initially, in the eastern parts, it is less severe. In the western parts, it is more severe.
And did you measure it somehow in your final equation?
Yeah, no, we cannot because the data are not available. But what is important is that the initial configuration of serfdom in terms of severity is working against us as researchers, right? Because in the East, it was less severe than in the West.
So it could be
Yeah.
connected with Black Death and the outcomes of Black Death.
So we use a bunch of geographic measures, controls that could be reflective, including, for example, measures of population density that could be associated, correlated with serfdom. Yeah. Okay, let's talk more about this in the Q&A. So let's look at the outcome and control variables. Here are our key dependent variables. In terms of Imperial Germany, we focus on the Conservative Party and its vote share in the 1871 election. We also use a robustness check where we look at the next election to ensure that our results are not an artificial outcome of a single election, right, where there could be, let's say, artificial or idiosyncratic factors that change the result. In Weimar Germany, as I already pointed out, we look at the NSDAP vote share in 1930 and 1932. And then we also use a bunch of additional outcomes in the appendix, for example, land inequality, because we think that reflects the socioeconomic power redistribution to some extent as well. And then there's a measure of net electoral disputes that has been used in previous studies focused on political dynamics in Imperial Germany, where net electoral disputes are seen as violations of democratic rules, right? And so elections are disputed by citizens because they believe that there's some kind of anti-democratic behavior going on in terms of manipulation. Okay, what are our control variables? And this speaks a little bit to the question that was just asked. We do not have, and this is a limitation, right? We do not have data on the exact distribution of serfdom, other than what we believe is a qualitative anecdotal insight from the literature about the severity of serfdom in the East and West. But we do have certain data, for example, urban density in the year 1300, that could be associated with the severity of serfdom. But then we have, importantly, also a bunch of controls that reflect distance to various trade-related features, such as, for example, major ports. A lot of trade happened through major ports. We also look at the distance to medieval trade cities, the ocean and large rivers, because, of course, rivers are also ways how people traded at the time. And as I mentioned, the Black Death primarily spread through trade at the time, and so it is important for us to control for all of this, because that could, to some extent, influence both the spread of the Black Death and the intensity, but also in the long run, it could affect socioeconomic development outcomes. And then finally, elevation is also something that we control for. And the simple reasoning behind controlling for elevation is that we believe areas that are, let's say, at a higher elevation are less easy to reach for people. Now let's look at this map here. This is Imperial Germany in 1871. And what we have here is an overview of our dependent variable and its geographic dispersion. We look here at the Conservative Party vote share in the 1871 election. And what you can see is that very clearly here in these parts of Germany, we see that the Conservative Party achieves better electoral outcomes. And let me point out something important. These results here of 0 and 100 are not just included for formal reasons, because they represent, of course, the minimum and the maximum that is theoretically possible. They were also the empirical range of the results. And the reason why the Conservative Party was able to achieve a 100% vote result in some of the eastern parts, which doesn't sound very democratic, is precisely because it was able to manipulate the elections in those areas. For example, through the intimidation of voters and through forcing them to vote in a certain way, through illegally throwing out ballots, coercing people, intimidation, clientelism. All of these were strategies that were used by the Conservative Party. And this, of course, is very much in line with what we believe about democratic culture. Yeah.
How do you handle candidates that run unopposed?
So we just assign, because running unopposed would also indicate that there's not a sufficiently strong democratic culture. So, I mean, it's really just the outcome here. And if a Conservative Party candidate ran unopposed, then that person would automatically get 100%, right? Okay, so let's now superimpose on this the Black Death outbreaks that we have historically, right? And you can see here also the mortality rates. And what is very clear immediately is that there's a very strong spatial association between where the Black Death was severe, where there were severe Black Death outbreaks, and then where the Conservative Party is weak. Of course, even in those areas, in some places, the Conservative Party gets a few votes, but in many, it is really not a factor at all in electoral politics at the time. Let me point out two specific observations. So, for example, this is the city of Münster with a 50% mortality rate, and this is the city of Frankfurt at the Oder River, which only had a 17% mortality rate. Okay, so now, as I mentioned, we construct the Black Death exposure intensity score. From this, here you can see the geographic distribution across space. So we have here lower values indicate a lower intensity of the Black Death. higher values indicate a higher intensity of the Black Death. And what we can see very clearly is this linear relationship with Conservative Party vote share, where the areas that are hit the hardest by the Black Death historically are literally these areas where the Conservative Party is not a factor in electoral politics at all. So we observe a very clear relationship also in terms of our regression analysis, the same relationship that you have just seen on the previous slide, more in terms of the visual analysis. And then we proceed to also look at the Germany 1930 and July 1932 elections, where we observe very similar dynamics. Here's again the geographic distribution. By the way, you can see the distribution is slightly different than the previous one, and there's a simple reason for that. After World War I, certain areas in the East, regions in the East, were taken away from Germany through the Treaty of Versailles, right? And so we have fewer of the areas that were historically only weakly affected by the Black Death. Nevertheless, what we see is that empirically we observe the same relationship, where the areas that were hit hardest by the Black Death then have the worst outcomes for the NSDAP, which of course was one of the most strongly anti-democratic parties in German history, or probably the most anti-democratic party. And so this is also in line with the thinking that these areas here, these areas fortunately had developed a strong democratic political culture that then in the long run meant that the NSDAP in those areas was less successful. This is also true for the July 1932 election, where we look at counties. Here we look at towns and cities, but in terms of the 1932 election, all of this because of data limitations. But we see, again, a very similar dynamic going on here. Now, I think a rightful criticism that we have heard very often when we presented this project is that the distance between what we look at historically, and that is the Black Death outbreak in the 14th century, and our outcomes, there's a very long temporal distance between the two, right? And so it was very important to us from the beginning of the project to underscore that we can observe that some of the mechanisms that we suspect to be behind this, right, the socioeconomic power redistribution, the introduction of proto-democratic institutions, that we can also observe this at different points in time. And so what we look at is, first of all, pre-Reformation Germany. The reason why we do this, we look at Germany in 1500, is because the Reformation, of course, then is another major, a dramatic political event that reshapes the German political landscape. And so what we want to show is that we can already observe institutional change prior to that event taking place. And what we look at is the introduction of participative elections at the town level, where we look at places that have introduced this as a mechanism for the population to participate in the election of the city council between 1300 and 1500. So prior to the Black Death and after the Black Death, right? And only places that have introduced this, I will show you a map of this in a moment, we code as having received those participative elections. And we see that the Black Death exposure intensity score is also systematically linked to this. And then in addition to this, we also look at socioeconomic indicators. And here the earliest indicators that are available to us, we deal with a lot of data limitations because this is a historical study. And the earliest reliable and comparable data that is available to us was collected by Prussia. And the reason is that Prussia, after the Napoleonic Wars, gained additional territories in Germany's west, and then the Prussian census agencies started to collect data there as well. So for the first time, it was possible to compare the different data sets because they were collected by the same agency. And what we see here is that the Black Death exposure intensity score is systematically linked to the proportion of large estates, which are indicative of serfdom, and then also the proportion of agricultural servants. And even though by that time, finally, serfdom was abolished, that happened in the early 19th century in Prussia, these agricultural servants are a remainder, an indicator for the prevalence of serfdom. Yeah? So they are not a perfect measure, but they are a proxy. Let's briefly look at this map. This is pre-1500 Germany. So, sorry, I should say this was 1500 Germany, right? Because it was the change in political institutions between 1300 and 1500. And what we can see here is the green circles are the areas where there was an introduction of participative elections. And very clearly we can see that most of the towns that had the introduction of participative elections, that was in the western parts of Germany that were more strongly hit by the Black Death. And we also do this in a regression format, not just visually, but I think for the presentation it's easier to look at visuals. Now, we were also challenged in terms of our results. And one of the challenges was a more of an empirical technical challenge, and that was the issue of unobserved regional heterogeneity. And specifically, there's a paper by Pepinski et al. At the time when we wrote the study, it was a working paper. Now it is published in the APSR as a research note. And they suggest that many legacy studies, so there are many studies in political science, political economy, economics more broadly, that look at long-term legacies of historical events. And they suggest there's a big technical problem with many of them, and one specific one that they also refer to. And they say there is often an absence of spatial fixed effects, and that leads to unobserved regional heterogeneity. And in less technical terms, what they claim is, and maybe this to some extent also addresses the claim about the differences in serfdom across different regions of Germany, that there could be initial factors, socioeconomic, political, that varied so much that they also explain later outcomes. And so what we try to do here is we try to introduce spatial fixed effects, but we believe we have to do this in a certain way, and that is that the way Pepinski et al. Do it in their own criticism is they introduce post-treatment fixed effects. And those of you who are familiar with quantitative social analysis know that there's a problem of post-treatment bias. If I introduce political units that were created after the treatment, because those political units could have been created in part as a response to the treatment, as a long-term outcome themselves. And so our response is twofold. The first one is we introduce quasi-random spatial fixed effects, which are simply rectangular cells that are 300 by 300 kilometers in size. And then we also use pre-treatment administrative spatial fixed effects, where we look at the administrative borders as they existed prior to the outbreak of the Black Death. Here's a quick overview. These are our quasi-random spatial fixed effects, and you can see here just the rectangular 300 by 300 kilometer cells that we create and how the different data points sort into them, right? And they receive just numbers instead of names because there's no specific historical, political, administrative unit associated with them. But what we effectively control for is spatial variation in initial characteristics across space, which is very important. In addition to that, as I mentioned, what we also use is the pre-treatment administrative borders, and you can see here Germany split into these many small political units that existed at the time. No unified nation state, but many smaller political units, and we also use those as a form of fixed effect. Now, there is a second and important criticism, and that is a challenge to the plausible exogeneity of the outbreaks, right? And we make this strong assumption, and I think it is justified to some extent, that the Black Death was plausibly exogenous because it hit a society that was completely unprepared, that didn't have the technical means or the medical means to respond to it effectively, right? The only response that I mentioned is that there might have been some inherent change of behavior related to the timing of the outbreak, and that is also something that we make use of. But let me also say that this assumption that we make is not completely unjustified and is in line with what historians have suggested. So Strayer here in his work on the origins of the state suggests that depression, famine, and plague could not have been warded off by any 14th century government. The necessary knowledge and techniques simply did not exist, right? So this is in line with our reasoning that the Black Death did not produce endogenous response mechanisms that were strong enough to relate it to certain, let's say, pre-existing political, economic, social characteristics. In addition to controlling for the observable factors that moderate the intensity, and that is trade, right, that we already acknowledged that we control for that, we believe, you know, if you think there is this, it could be that there are political, social, economic pre-existing factors that shape mortality, then we employ a second regression technique to address this, and that is a form of instrumental variable or two-stage least square regression, where we look at Black Death cyclicality. We make use of the fact that the Black Death was more severe in the summer months than in the winter months. And so what we do here is we predict the level of the local mortality rate by looking at dummies for first quarter, second quarter, third quarter. And what we see here is very clearly that in the second quarter, we see a higher mortality rate just predicted on the timing of the outbreak, right? So the Black Death has an 8.7 percentage point higher mortality rates at a statistically significant level in the areas that were hit in the summer term or where it started in April, May, or June, right? and so that means that it could last throughout the entire summer if it started in that second quarter. A second dynamic that we see is in line with what we suggested earlier. When you looked at the map of the spatial distribution, the areas that were hit later had less severe outbreaks, so the more the Black Death progresses, the less severe it becomes, and this is also reflected in these data. So again, we find a confirmation for one of our key assumptions. And so let me now conclude the talk. So the Black Death certainly represents one of the most important critical junctures in history. You may be familiar with this term, critical juncture. That's a term from comparative historical analysis. And the critical junctures literature has put a lot of emphasis on moments in history that have really reshaped society in one form or another. And it is interesting that no one, at least prior to this study, has paid attention to the political, the severe encompassing of great magnitude political consequences of the Black Death. And so this is our contribution. We look at the political outcomes, we look at the long-term effects in particular, and we look at the spatial variation, really take that aspect of the Black Death very seriously. Our findings are that there were long-term changes in what we think are political economic equilibria, where the socioeconomic power redistribution reinforces political institutions and then leads to long-term sustained changes in political economic equilibria. This is reflected both in the socioeconomic structures, political institutions, and voting, and we have found evidence in all of these dimensions from different points in time. And I just want to qualify our finding, and I mentioned something like this at the beginning. Of course, not all other pandemics will have the same outcomes. The Black Death is really unique in terms of the magnitude of the effect it had, the death rate. So the Black Death is a unique historical pandemic, but maybe that is why we see that it had these fundamental, substantial society-shaping effects. The key insight then was that Black Death had multifaceted, comprehensive, and lasting effects, and the political cultures that resulted from it affected voting behavior even 500 years later. And so that is the key insight from our study, and I want to thank you for listening to me so patiently for such a long time. If you're interested in the article, you can now openly download it on the World Politics website, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much. This was very fascinating. Could I ask you to go back to the slide with the Conservative Party vote share from the 1870s? Yes. I have two questions to that. Yes. One would be,
there we go.
To me, this fits very well the old school separation of the East Albion and West Albion socioeconomic patterns. So how do you relate to that tradition of identifying Grundherrschaft and Gutwirtschaft and so on?
Yeah.
So that's the first one.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the second one would be, for an old school, common sense, qualitative historian, this would be a result of a series of factors over centuries, not just one.
Yeah, sure.
What would be your response to that?
Yeah. These are great questions. Let me start with the later one, right? So we have heard critical, feedback from historians on that, right? And I do acknowledge that our study has a lot of imperfections to it, but I think some of the criticism has resulted from a difference in the way these disciplines work. So the way I perceive history is that it is primarily interested in the unique characteristics, the idiosyncrasies, the specialities of every historical episode by itself, right? So historians are interested in the whole complexity of every single case, and they naturally refrain from more abstract theoretical perspectives where they look at patterns over time, right? I think the social sciences work slightly differently in that we sometimes make simplifying assumptions, and the reason is we have to make these simplifying assumptions to find those general patterns and trends, right? And so you are right, what we do in this project is we simplify and we portray things as simpler than they really are. There are a lot of historical events that happen in between. But what I also very strongly believe is that these proto-democratic institutions that were introduced at the beginning, that there was no no centralized political regime that could have interfered with them in a really effective way. There was no absolute monarchy in Germany, right? There was no centralized state. There were no strong centralized institutions that interfered with these local conditions. And that is the reason why they were able to persist. And also one historical example of this, the kind of endogenous strength, the ability of these institutions to present themselves as self-enforcing, is that in the southwestern parts of Germany there was the so-called Peasants' War. As a historian, you are certainly very familiar with that. And what happened here is that the elites, after the serfs had gotten out of the situation in which they were in, right, this more control hierarchical situation, they had been able to acquire those freedoms. The elites wanted to reinforce the old institutions, but the serfs now had gained the ability to collectively self-organize, and that is one of the reasons why they effectively fought against the elites in the Peasants' War and maintained their freedoms, right? And so these events, of course, they play a role in this, but they are related to the initial change in political, socioeconomic institutions, right? You are right that your first question about the eastern parts, right? This is very much in line with this, prominent distinction between East and West, and in terms of the Gutherrschaft that you mentioned. We think this is, in part, a long-term outcome of exactly these historical dynamics that we describe. Yeah. So we see that as a direct outcome. Yeah.
Hi. It seems that it's off, but. Okay.
You have to speak up a little.
Okay, thanks a lot. That was really fascinating, and I find it very convincing. I just would like to ask you about alternative maybe possibilities of explaining your finding. First, can you really be sure that what we are observing is not an initial difference in trading places? So, because I assume that the Black Death hit places where there was higher trade, as you said. Are we really sure that these differences were not pre-existing the Black Death? And then I was wondering whether there are two alternative mechanisms that can be more at the individual level instead of institutional level. So first, could it be that after the Black Death, there was internal migration? So places that were less hit, so then there were some people who were kind of more free to move, or let's say the more progressive people at that time, they moved to places that were more hardly hit. So then what we are seeing is the effect of a kind of composition effect, so population changes in the population, the individual level. And the last point is we have evidence, for example, from the COVID pandemic that increased social trust. So I was wondering whether this is not an alternative explanation. It can be combined, of course, with your institution explanation, but whether it could be that in the places that were more hardly hit, people kind of developed this stronger sense of social trust because of they were more in need of other people, and that maybe, translates into higher votes for progressive party, less conservative party. Yeah. Thank you.
So thank you so much for these really important questions. So let me point out something important. So you are right, the Black Death spread through trade, right? That is an underlying assumption that we make here, right? But this is also why we try to very, very comprehensively control for trade factors. And let me point this out, right? So we have the distance to major ports, the distance explicitly to medieval trade cities, right? Centers of trade, we have it to ocean and to large rivers. For every individual unit, we compute the distance to all of these trade features, and so we have multiple predictors that really should be strongly correlated with trade intensity. In addition to that, the spatial fixed effects should take care of pre-existing levels of trade if they were region-wide, right? If certain regions, let's say in the East, were exposed to less trade than regions in the West, we do have an empirical response to that. I do believe this is a major factor, and this is why we tried through so many different means to control for it. Yeah, you are absolutely right in that respect. The migration explanation is, or let's say, this is to some extent a threat to our analysis, right? Let me respond to it like this. Of course, migration always happens, right? We can never restrict it, and at that time when we do not have strong nation states that guard their borders through sophisticated means, migration might even be a little bit easier than it is in the present day. I so the perspective that I embrace as a social scientist is one of these equilibria. I believe that societies are often in a state of a political and economic equilibrium where certain institutions and culture and behavior of people are mutually self-reinforcing. And I will give you an interesting example of this, or two interesting examples of this are one, when people believe that, and many people around them are more corrupt, they also tend to be more corrupt. There's experimental evidence in the literature that shows this, right? So if you believe that you are in an equilibrium state where a lot of people are corrupt, you are also more likely to be corrupt. Just one small example of this equilibrium behavior. I've also found in my own research, in this case on bureaucracy, that bureaucracies are institutions that are constantly self-reinforcing and that are in a state of equilibrium in terms of interacting with societies. And very much like that, I also believe that if we look at the fundamental political institutions that, for example, enable elites to coerce societies, to control them, that they are very much in line with the socioeconomic power that these elites have. So if they have high levels of land inequality where the elites possess a lot of land, have control over all of the resources, both political and economic resources, that is self-reinforcing. And if there's a bit of migration, that will be absorbed by those political economic equilibria, right? So that is my perspective as a social scientist. And now very briefly on your last issue, the one on social trust and political trust. So let me just be very clear, the Black Death was an event that reshaped all aspects of society, right? And I cannot stand here and tell you, well, it didn't affect social or political trust. It certainly did. But what I also believe is that if we look at the aggregate of effect of the Black Death in the social, political, cultural, economic domain, that everything points into this direction of shifting us to a more egalitarian political equilibrium and a more egalitarian economic equilibrium. And so I would say that this is a plausible additional mechanism, but it doesn't contradict anything that I've said, right? So, yeah.
Thank you. Fascinating presentation. I'm Christine Ben, a medical doctor, and my question is more in relation to health behavior and how that might have been affected. And what came into mind was the DIAS advisory board member Peter Baldwin's book on the cholera epidemics in Germany. And I was just wondering whether you had looked, because they, as I remember it, it's a while since I read it, but there were these very different responses in different entities. So some entities really looked at this as a social problem and thought, well, it's the poor people, poor nutritional status who succumb to cholera, so therefore we have to have measures to increase their standards of living and so on, whereas other entities were closing borders and saying, we're just keeping to ourselves, we don't want anybody to enter here. They saw nobody had a good explanation for the cholera, but they had very distinct and almost like, binary responses to the cholera pandemic. So I was just wondering whether you had thought of linking your data to subsequent cholera pandemics in the 19th century, and to see if I would be interested in whether the response to the Black Death would respond or influence how the states subsequently responded to the cholera, and whether that also could be an intermediate variable in your then progression towards what happened in the elections.
This is a super important question, and let me just reply to it in different ways. So the first thing is that Dan Gingrich and I actually plan a book project where we want to look at the political economy of different pandemics. So not just the Black Death, but different pandemics, and we could, of course, include the cholera pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic. We want to look at all of them and also think about what are the general tendencies of pandemics, how do they influence society, not just this most severe pandemic, right? A comment that we have received more often is to look at other smaller outbreaks of the Black Death, because the Black Death was introduced to Europe through this major pandemic, but then there were recurring outbreaks over the centuries. Again and again, major cities were hit by the Black Death. The difference was that at this time, and this is really why we make this exogeneity assumption, that at this time society was really mostly unprepared, right? And so the key distinction is that in later pandemics, people had some experience with the Black Death and they had more endogenous response mechanisms. Also, many of these pandemics were more regional in character, so they were not nationwide or Europe-wide. They were more regional, local outbreaks, and so we don't expect that they have the same consequence in terms of these major shifts in political economic equilibria. Another aspect of your question was, what if there were slight differences in the way different localities responded, right? So the way I would reply to this is as a quantitative social scientist. And I'm not sure to what extent you are familiar with regression analysis, but this would be reflected in the error term, right? Because that is, I mean, as long as these differences in the local responses are not completely systematic, right? As long as they are random across space, which is an important assumption, we do account for some systematic variation across space through the regional fixed effects. But as long as within individual regions, the municipalities respond in a way that could be a little bit more effective or a little bit less effective, as long as that is not systematically related to any pre-existing characteristics that we do not control for, it should be fine. And so as a quantitative social scientist, I would say, well, that would be in the error term to some extent, right? Yeah, or I would hope it is.
Christine handed me the mic afterwards. My name is Nina Bonnerup Dohn. I'm not a social scientist. I'm not a historian. I'm a philosopher of education, perhaps. So my question will be sort of a lay question in this regard. But I would like to follow up on Jeppe's question about different different things that can impact different, and specifically, I'd like you to say something about the Reformation, because looking at your map, it doesn't fit the distribution of Protestant and Catholic. And I would have thought that if the Black Death had that very large effect, it would also have affected how people reacted 200 years later on to reformist thinking. So is that a completely different thing? Why is it a completely different thing? Or I'm expecting you to say that it's not a completely different thing, but then why isn't it, and why is the distribution not at all similar? Or well, not very similar at least.
These are great questions. Now, what I will say is our project is not primarily focused on the Reformation, and I'm not a complete expert when it comes to it. So I have not personally investigated the reasons for the Reformation, why it was strong in certain areas, strong in others. Our response is more an empirical. One part of it I've already presented, another one I will tell you about in just a moment. But the part that I presented, and I think is maybe the most important response, is that we show that the behavior of the Black Death or the impact of the Black Death is already observable prior to the Reformation, right? And so that is, I think, the most important initial response. Now, what was the effect of the Reformation? Germany split, and large parts of Europe then split into the Protestant and the Catholic parts, right? And here's another empirical response that we offer in the appendix of the study. We also present our results when we include the share of Catholics in a district as an additional control variable. There's an empirical problem with doing that, and that is the introduction of post-treatment bias, because exactly as you said, the share of Catholics, the Reformation itself and the dynamics, how it unfolded, could be affected to some extent by the Black Death as a major preceding historical event, right? So we refrain from introducing this variable in our main regressions. But we want to also show that our results are actually completely robust. Even if you include share of Catholics as an additional measure, we observe the exact same dynamics. So share of Catholics, which has often been associated also by historians with the distribution of the vote share, for example, for the Conservative Party or even for the NSDAP, even if we include this major alternative explanation and the direct measure of it in our regressions, we still observe the exact same results and in terms of magnitude effect. So this does not change our effects at all. I think my response might not be completely satisfactory to the extent that I cannot provide a strong systematic reasoning for why the Reformation broke out in different places. That is not just some, I mean, I like to refrain from commenting on things that I've not extensively done research on and where I cannot offer a very systematic response. But what we hope is that through these two methods, we respond to that concern empirically. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Let me be difficult. Could you explain for me in theoretical way why something that happened for, I don't know, it lasted for 5 years, 500 years ago, had more impact on our political behavior now than serfdom, about which you don't know many things. And you just can't rule it out. So what makes you think to believe that something that happened for such a short period of time and can have such a huge impact? And just because right now, after COVID happened how many years ago? Who cares now? Basically, I mean, we didn't change our behavior that much. And we are totally exposed to information. And when you're talking about Germany at that time, I really don't think why you decided to take control with these 300 per 300 kilometers, because what it means in terms of people were traveling for 300 kilometers, people were traveling for 10 kilometers per day at best. It means 30 days of traveling from one border to another. Does it make any sense apart from empirically consistent and robust with something? Thank you.
Yeah, so first of all, great question. Let me just say one important clarification. We do not anywhere make the prediction that our political behavior now is changed by it, right? We refer only to political behavior in the first half of the 20th century, the later part of the 19th century. So these are our latest outcomes. We do not look at political behavior now. I also think the assumption that just because an event is short, let's say a few years in duration, means that it cannot be massively impactful. Let me give you another event that was massively impactful and it's just lasted 6 years. That was World War II, right? We would never say, oh, World War II only lasted 6 years in human history, that it was not impactful, right? It reshaped the global distribution of power. It created the conditions for the Cold War. It led to the creation of the United Nations, and the US for the first time was an unchallenged superpower in the West. The Black Death, historically, was a pandemic that was unparalleled in terms of the death rate that it produced, and it hit a society that was completely unprepared and did not have strong response mechanisms. So yes, it was an event that only lasted for a few years, but find me any event in human history, other than, let's say, World War II or World War I, that really can be compared within such a short time, had such a massive effect on societies. And this is why we think, especially under the conditions that I presented to you, the German case where we have no centralized political regime and local political units can persist for many centuries, I think these are the conditions under which it is most credible that the effects of such a major event would persist for a long time period. And you're right that cells 300 by 300 kilometer, that is to some extent an arbitrary choice. This is why we also use the pre-existing administrative units, right? And my response here would be to you that these pre-existing units and their geographical sizes have a lot of meaning because they reflect, for example, transaction costs in terms of information exchange, ruling, and political power, right? So in that sense, I mean, we use one method that is more, let's say, empirical, and then we use one that is very political, embedded in the historical circumstances at the time. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I should probably come with a disclaimer. I'm a physicist, and as such, I'm a kind of an ignorant to many of the things you mentioned, but I'm nevertheless a little intrigued by the more kind of general concept where on the one hand you are using linear analysis like linear response models, which are great for deterministic systems, of course. And then on the other hand you have what I would consider a highly a complex dynamical system. And so how does it work that you use linear analysis to somehow predict basically a transition from one equilibrium to another, because usually we don't see those transitions in only linear response of the system. So it's just general.
Yeah. So I would you know, like take issue with one of the assumptions of your question, and that is that linear models are only good to predict deterministic systems. I actually have the opposite view as a social scientist. I think what is inherent to the modern social sciences is that we make probabilistic predictions, right? And linear models, linear regression reflects that to the extent that we believe there's always uncertainty about the exact nature, magnitude of the outcome, right? And so we have both uncertainty about the magnitude of the outcome, but also uncertainty about our prediction. It can go up and down based on random factors that we cannot control for and that are not observed. Those are contained in the error terms. So, I mean, you are right that the underlying dynamics are very complex. These are complex systems. At the same time, I think that the models we use to some extent reflect that uncertainty about the complexity of reality.
But it's just rare that a linear perturbation of the system takes it out of its equilibrium.
Well, you know, I mean, let's also acknowledge the fact that this was a very simple society, right, that was initially hit. And so I guess the linear response model that we use, actually we also use we use logit response, which are also linear in at least in the parameters, but we use logit and tobit response models. You know, if a society that is not that complex is hit by, you know, such an event where the effect would go into one direction, I think these are the appropriate models. You know, we can debate this. We can debate this absolutely. I just think it is not accurate to say that our predictions are deterministic. It's rather the opposite. They are probabilistic. Yeah, yeah.
All right, thank.
A simple question.
Yeah.
What is simple society at then?
Compared to ours, right? It is
Really?
the yeah.
You really believe it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Provide any historical research that proves your belief.
So I mean, look, so I know that historians have a fundamentally different view on society, but look, let me, of course, and you know, this is I really, you know, I mean, I make a lot of use of the insights of historians in my analyses, and I'm very thankful for all the analysis that they present. Where I say that our societies are more complex is, first of all, in the technological realm. We have access to many, many more technologies. We have a much more complex division of labor. Look at the range of jobs that exist in present-day societies. There are maybe 100,000, 150, 200,000 different kinds of jobs that one can have. In this society, maybe there were 200, 300, 400. I don't have an exact number for you, but the division of labor has become so much more complex since the introduction of industrialization. So our societies are very different. Our access to knowledge, our access to education, all of this has fundamentally changed. Most people at this time had very simple lives where they did not gain a lot of education. They worked in a single job, lived in a single town for their entire lives. So the patterns of social interaction were much more limited in nature than they are today.
We're far over time, but it also speaks to how interesting this topic is. So let's give Jan another thanks.
Thank you so much.